In this lesson, we'll take a look at expressions and the blast node while we continue to build out the wheel assembly for our car. So we've got this little inner brake drum piece sort of at a good point, and what we need to do is to continue to construct the larger tire element that's around it. Let's take a quick look at our reference before we begin that part. So here's what we're kind of modeling this after. And you can see that we've got this sort of inside element. Let me pause this. Got this sort of inside element already created. And what we need to do now is to create this larger tire element. Now, I started with a circle before because basically the shape of this inside piece was sort of very similar to the primitive of a circle. Well, for the outside piece, I want to start with a tube because that shape is much, much closer to what it is that we're going to want to create. So let's jump back into Houdini. And let's create a tube. So let's make sure that we're on the Create tab here on this main shelf. And if you need to, remember there are these little buttons that you can use to move back and forth across the tools that are available. And I see the third icon from the left here is the tube icon. Now, I want to place that tube just right at the middle of my scene. So let's go ahead and use the Control on the keyboard and then click on the tube icon. And that will create a new tube for me. However, what it's done is it's created that tube right in the center, and it's created that tube in its own container outside back at the object level. So I'm back at the root of my scene, and I've been given a new tube. Now to modify or adjust this tube, I'm going to have to come inside here and make all of those changes. So for right now, I think what I want to do is actually move that tube over into our wheel assembly container. And simply enough, all I have to do is highlight it, make sure it's highlighted, do Control X on the keyboard. That will cut the object out of this container called Tube Object 1. And then I can double click to dive inside of my wheel assembly, and I can paste it right here. So now I have the tube inside the same network as the wheel assembly. I'm going to return back to the object level and just grab this tube object container, double click inside, make sure that it is the empty one. And we're just going to select it and delete it. I just hit the delete key on my keyboard to get rid of it. So now let's dive back inside the wheel assembly. And notice that I can really only have my display flag set at any one of these particular spots. So I can have it set here and I can see the tube. Or I can have it set over here and I can see the work that we've done for the wheel assembly, or for the brake assembly inside of the wheel. How can I get to where I can see both of these at the same time? Well, Houdini lets us do this via the merge node. So let's just put down a merge node. Very simply, I'm going to hit tab. That'll bring up my tab menu. And then I'm going to type MER, and there you'll see the merge node. Place the merge node here inside of our network view. And all you have to do is wire these two things into the merge node. So again, I'm going to click on this little output here from the polycap, click on it once, then click on the input to the merge, and then do the same thing with the tube. Click on the tube, and then click on the merge. Now I can move my display flag down to the merge node and see both of those objects at the same time. Okay? Now, notice I did get this warning that occurred on the merge node, and that's because it's got some mismatched attributes. Now, I know that because I can bring up that information by middle-clicking on the node in the node network. When I do, I get this little box of information, and at the bottom I see a warning, and it says a mismatch of attributes on the inputs was detected. Some attribute values may not be initialized to expected values. So basically what this is telling me is that there's some information on this tube and some other information on this string here with all of these nodes. And when the information is trying to be brought together so we can see it here in the viewport, there's some conflicts that are happening. And what's happening is there are normals that have been generated on one side and not on the other. Now, the reason that this node is not completely red is because it's just a warning. It's just telling you, hey, this might not look right, but you might not care. So we don't necessarily have to fix it just yet. We will fix it here in a little bit, but for now, we're just going to accept that this is a warning and move along. By the way, you can do that with any node. at any point, you can just make sure you're hovering in the middle area of the icon of the node, and then just middle click, and you'll get some extra information that you can learn a lot about the pieces of geometry and where they're at inside the node network by middle clicking on these nodes and just kind of reading through what they're doing and where they're at. So let's go ahead and move the tube into place where we want it. Now we can do this in several different ways. First thing we want to do is probably make sure that the orientation of the tube is facing the way that we want the tire to be. I can look here at my little indicator in the lower left-hand corner of my scene view and see that I probably want that tube facing along the x-axis. So I'm going to change my orientation from y to x. And now what I need to do is center that tube. Now I really want it to be exactly centered as well. So how do I get it just perfectly centered? Well, there's a couple of different ways to approach it. I could use snapping. That's one way that I could do that. And we kind of talked about snapping to the grid and points over here by using these tools. But what happens then if I move one element, the other one won't necessarily follow? So in order to get the tube perfectly positioned over the center of the brake assembly, I'm going to use something called expressions. Now, expressions are very, very easy to use inside of Houdini. In fact, it's just a matter of copying and pasting certain points of information. So right now I can see that the value of the center of the tube is 0 in x, negative 0.384519 in y, and 1.12726 in z. And again, we could use our value ladder, and we could kind of adjust it till we get it very close. We could use snapping. We could use the handle tools here till we get it pretty close. But really what we want to do is copy and paste. So I'm going to take a look at my circle. Now my circle has a center here of a value that's already been established, that we set it into place based off of where the car was. I'm going to highlight that center value, make sure that it's highlighted, right click, and copy parameter. Okay, so with that done, now I'm going to move down here to my tube, and for its center value, I'm going to make sure it's highlighted, right click on it, and come down to paste copied relative references. Okay, now we'll talk about this relative references here in just a second, but go ahead and execute that by clicking on it. And notice that what's happened is Houdini wrote some little expressions for us. It went ahead and put some text in these fields so that the values here align with the values of the original circle up here. If you need to see what these expressions are evaluating to, in other words, what are the actual numbers that are in here instead of just seeing that it's a expression driving it, all you have to do is make sure that center is highlighted and left click on it. When you do, you'll get the indication of the values that are actually being placed inside of those channels. Also notice that they've turned this sort of dark green color. Now the dark green color is in case you leave this node so that you're seeing these values, you'll know that there is actually an expression that is controlling the position of those values. To see the expressions again, or to edit those expressions, all you have to do is again make sure that the word is highlighted, the property is highlighted, and left click on it. When you do, it will toggle back to showing you what those expressions are that are actually driving it. So I mentioned that we were going to talk about the term relative references and what that means exactly. Well, remember earlier we discussed how Houdini works kind of like an operating system. Well, this is very much a callback to that concept. First off, anytime that you see these brackets here, it basically is telling you that I'm using a certain expression. In this case, the expression is just CH. And what CH stands for is a channel reference. Okay? So the channel reference pulls values from any other channel anywhere in Houdini. If we wanted to, we could come over to the poly extrude and use any of these values as well to drive any other value of any other tool or node inside of Houdini. It's extremely, extremely flexible that way. In this case, what we've done is the channel that we're looking for is from our circle, and in the X value here, we're using the circle's translate X. Now, first of all, you might be saying, well, how do I know that tx means translate x? And how did I know that I was coming back to the circle that's in this particular section? Well, this reads very much like a relative path in an operating system. The ... basically refers to going up one level outside of the particular node that you're on. So right now we're on tube 1. We're not looking for another value on tube 1. We need to come outside back into this general space inside of the wheel assembly. So that's what the ... tells us. It says, hey, I'm coming up one level to some other node out here inside this network. Then it's just a path to the node. Well, I want circle 1. So we come up here and we say, okay, I was out here and I found circle 1. Well, what property or channel, so that's where CH, what channel is it from circle 1 that I want to use? Well, I want to use TX. Now, if I click on circle 1 here, I look at the center, and you might say, well, how is TX the center? Well, TX basically is referring to the translation of the object. So the center is defined by where it's translated to in the scene. And if you hover over the word center and just leave your mouse alone for a second, you'll get a little description of what it is. So it says here that the parameters that we're actually dealing with in Houdini expression language is TX, TY, and TZ. And that defines the location of the center of the circle. So knowing that, looking back here, this expression really starts to become very clear. I need to pull a channel from a node that's not myself called circle 1, and the channel I want is TX. So just follow it back. A node that's not myself out here somewhere called circle 1, and the values are TX, TY, and TZ. So there's your first look at using very simple expressions to sort of help you polymodel and line things up. In the next lesson, we'll start to look at some of the other nodes that we're going to use to finish out the tire and wheel assembly.